Welcome to this evening's live from DC program, Global Security and Great Power Relations. I'm Mark Williams, Director of the Rohatyn Center for Global Affairs at Middlebury College. In a minute, I'll be joined by a panel of professionals who will discuss a range of global security issues and the future career options that are implied by efforts to address those. Later during the Q&A portion of this program, we'll be joined by a few students with questions about future opportunities for security-related careers. One thing that I'd like to stress before we begin is that our discussion tonight is not for attribution. As the relative power of America's global competitors grows, key aspects of global security rest increasingly on the capacity of great powers, China, the EU, Britain, India, Japan, Russia, and the US, to cooperate in tackling some of the world's most pressing challenges. Now, among these challenges are things like climate change, cybersecurity, illicit trafficking, pandemics, proliferation, terrorism, others. Because of their transnational nature, collaboration among great powers is essential to address these types of challenges, yet cooperation is hardly guaranteed. So the questions arise. Can adversarial relationships be set aside? Can frayed alliances be restored? And can old arrangements be repurposed to achieve the broader common good and enhance global security? And finally, for those interested in career opportunities in the security field, what do those opportunities look like? Right now, let me introduce our panel guests. Dr. Stuart Patrick is with the Council on Foreign Relations, where he's the James H. Binger Senior Fellow in Global Governance and Director of the International Institutions and Global Governance Program. Stuart received his doctorate from Oxford University. Before moving to the Council on Foreign Relations, he was a research fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington. He also served as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, where he helped develop responses to a range of global and transnational issues, including refugees and migration, international law enforcement, and global health affairs. Stuart's areas of expertise include multilateral cooperation on global issues, exactly our topic tonight, US policy toward international institutions, including the UN, and the challenges posed by fragile and post-conflict states. He's the author or editor of 6 books, including his latest, The Sovereignty Wars, Reconciling America with the World. Finally, Stuart is a proud parent of the class of 2024. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you so much.
Also joining me is David Weisner. David comes to us from the State Department, where he's currently the Deputy Director for Press and Strategic Communications and the spokesperson for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Prior to this, David ran the political and economic section at the US Embassy in Algeria. He was the Tunisia desk officer at the State Department and also staff assistant to 2 assistant secretaries of state for Near Eastern Affairs. He's held a variety of other posts within the Foreign Service, including stints at US embassies in Khartoum, Sudan, Bangui, and Central African Republic. David speaks Arabic and French, and he's a 2004 graduate of Middlebury College. David, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Rounding out our panel is Stone Conroy. Stone is the manager for the Geopolitical Analysis and Intelligence team at United Airlines. In that capacity, he conducts risk assessments of international security issues and provides analytical support to company leaders during crisis situations such as terrorist attacks, political instability, civil unrest. Besides his job at United, Stone is also the co-director of the Chicago chapter of the Truman National Security Project. And prior to this, he spent several years with the State Department's Overseas Security Advisory Council, where he helped promote security cooperation and information sharing between the Department of State and private sector organizations around the world. Stone's also worked at several nonprofits in the peace-building arena, and in 2013 and 14, he was a Boren Fellow in Nigeria, where he worked on conflict management programs for Mercy Corps. Stone holds a master's degree in conflict resolution from Georgetown, and he's a 2010 graduate of Middlebury College. Stone, thank you for coming.
Thanks, Mark.
Gentlemen, there are so many things that we could talk about with respect to global security. We probably won't have time to cover all the topics that could be discussed, but let's start with a question about your broad panoramic view of global security. And we'll just go down the list. We'll start with Stuart and then David and then Stone. Now, here's the question. How does the global security landscape look to you today? And what do you see in the future? I mean, are there certain areas or regions beyond, say, the Middle East where you think security concerns are becoming more intense? Are the most pressing security threats the military ones, or are they non-military? When you actually look at the landscape for global security, what do you see and what do you anticipate seeing down the line? Stu, would you
Thank you
like
so
to
much,
start?
Mark. Great pleasure to be on this panel and also to be a parent of mid-course students. I think when we look at just at the broadest sort of 30,000 foot level, we confront a world that has a lot more geopolitical rivalry than we thought when the Obama administration, for instance, took charge 12 years ago. There are a lot of major doubts about U.S. staying power and leadership in the world, which I think have been redoubled by the Trump administration's experiences. And then we see a proliferation of transnational security threats for which a lot of effective international institutions simply don't exist or are really hamstrung. So just really quickly on the regions, I think that the United States would love to get out of the Middle East more. That's, I think, maybe more David's bailiwick, and he might be able to speak about that. But that will depend a lot on the Iranian nuclear deal and whether or not that can be restored. I think it's Asia really that's going to continue to grow in importance and be the most turbulent area. You've got rivalry between India and China. You have the question of Northeast Asian security and the future of North Korea's nuclear weapons ambitions. You've got Chinese assertiveness in the South and East China Seas, as well as over Taiwan, and a lot of dangers over miscalculations between the United States and China that could erupt actually into a shooting war. With respect to your question about security and how we should think about it today, I think, I've been making the argument that we should broaden our concepts of security beyond just sort of interstate competition, although that's really important, and beyond just nuclear competition, although that will remain, to include what have been called threats without a threatener. And here I just pick a couple. COVID-19 has basically shown us how important global health security and pandemics are, because that pandemic has brought the United States to its knees in a way that no armed adversary ever has. And the other, of course, is climate change, and associated with that biodiversity collapse. Today, President Biden declared climate change an existential threat, and we need to consider sort of the fate of the biosphere as a really important security threat. We need to govern the world as if the Earth mattered, in other words. So I think the hierarchy of security threats has indeed changed. But I'll stop it there because I want to hear what my panelists have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Gosh, I feel like Stuart really hit all the high points. I think as we enter into a new administration now, the United States is facing sort of mirrored challenge, which I think really did exist in 2016, but had not come in to such stark advantage. And I think there was still sort of a hangover from the Cold War. If I could, with agreeing with absolutely everything that Stuart said, I think we really have to be thinking about the United States is when we think about our national security, we have to be thinking about our national state and how we are after 4 years of the Trump administration, but frankly, the cleavages that existed within our society run much deeper than that. Whether it's racial inequity, whether it's continued gender challenges, whether it's regional challenges, whether it's the huge, enormous challenge posed by economic inequality. The reason that America, to me, the reason that America is where it is on the national stage right now, we got here because of our national power, and we're struggling to find and conceptualize our place because of those cleavages that exist at home. So I would encourage those of us who are listening today to really think about ourselves first, on the security as an ability for us to pose strength abroad. And I think if there's the real challenge that's sitting in front of President Biden, it's really that it's rebuilding a sense of national purpose, which since 1989, I think you could argue that abroad we've lacked a national purpose. And all of the things that you've laid out, to me, lay out a rather coherent approach to what should be our national purpose. All the items, Professor Williams, that you laid out should be the bedrock, should be the core, the pillars, in addition to recreating our economic strength at home, should be what we really focus on going forward. So I think this would be a terrific discussion.
Thank you. Stone?
Yeah, I'd like to echo both Stuart and David and say I think that solidarity is really important for the global community, and that we need to have a set of values, not just from a US perspective, but globally, working on some of the thematic challenges that we're going to deal with for the next 10, 20, 100 plus years. Looking around the world at the global security landscape, I think outside of the Middle East, a couple of things pop into my mind right away, and Stuart mentioned two. The India-Pakistan border is something I think about a lot in my job because I'm looking at overflight risks, and with the summer of 2019's shutdown of the Pakistan airspace and everything that goes on between those two countries as nuclear powers, it's something I'm concerned with. And now recently we have China and India pushing up against each other on the northern Sikkim border. We saw just this last week another scuffle between the two militaries there. I think that's something to be concerned with going forward. Also in Asia, as Stuart mentioned again, the South China Sea issue, I'm constantly looking at overflight concerns in that region and military activity in the Gulf of Tonkin we got coming up. There's a military drill. So that's a concern, I think, going forward, not just for me in my role in looking at aviation concerns, but I think globally it's a huge issue. A couple things I'd like to add. Pressure from climate change. So what we saw a few years back was a northern migration of folks up through Turkey into Europe. And we've had a bit of a lull on that front. But I think as climate change begins to really wreak havoc, especially in areas along the Sahel and other places further south, you're going to see more people using those same migratory routes to head into Europe. And the pressures that are going to affect the European governments on that front will be much worse, I think, than we saw during the refugee crisis years back. And then same in South America and Central America. We don't often in the US look southward at our neighbors as a major security consideration, but I think, again, climate change is going to push folks further north, and that is something that we need to think about very seriously as a US government in the coming years.
Thank you. It sounds like you all see a landscape of complexity, a landscape that is evolving in terms of the intensity of security issues. And your responses more or less dovetail with the next question that I have. It's a general question, and to some extent we may have already addressed it, but let me pose it anyway. It's another broad question. Which of the following issues do you think at the moment represents the greatest threats to global security, and why? And I'll just mention these in no particular order. How would we rank them? At least what's at the top? Pandemics, WMD proliferation, terrorism, climate change, cybersecurity, illicit trafficking, or perhaps something that's not even on that list. Why don't we start this time with David?
Well, none of them are rosy subjects, and all of them are going to pose their specific challenges. But I think if you really want to look at the multifaceted nature of the challenge, I think it really does have to begin with climate change. I think, as Stone pointed out, we are ill prepared from a standpoint of the cost that it's going to incur, of the requirement for international coordination that it's gonna require, and the state system itself, the Westphalian state system itself, and the self-interest that different countries have in the face of this changing world are really, I mean, are deeply problematic, and I don't think can be really understated. There have been, you know, at a time when international coordination is needed, there has been a retrenchment. You know, I think if you listen to everything that the new administration is talking about, you know, they have mentioned very clearly that alliances are hugely important to the United States, not because they are, sorry, my daughter is coming in there, not because they are, they're something we just like. It's because alliances keep this country safer and more prosperous. And they are an affordable way to project American power. And you know, at this point, you know, there's real questions to be asked. Can you revitalize, you know, if in 4 years you think that there might be a change? I personally believe that the national power that the United States can muster means that we can. But it's going to require, to me, taking on the challenge of climate change, it cannot happen absent US leadership. And again, I come back to my initial point of, you know, the lack of common purpose in the United States is a real hamstring to mobilizing global action. Everyone realizes what the problem is, but just kind of saying that the private sector is going to take care of things, and you know, the states and sub-state actors, and I do hope we can get to sort of actually something I think is going to be really important in the global security field is the role of sub-state actors. But you know, that where we stand today, we are ill prepared structurally to take on the challenges of climate change.
Thank you. Stone, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot recently about a statement that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made back in April about the challenge facing the globe with regard to COVID-19. And he said, basically, we have two challenges here. One is a scientific one, and another is solidarity, essentially. And just a few weeks ago, he said, well, I think it's clear that science won, but solidarity did not. And this is not a good sign for us as a global community going forward, that we had this common enemy that we all needed to work toward to solve this problem. And we weren't really able to do it from a solidarity standpoint. And I'd like to say that I believe that will change in the future when we tackle the much bigger issue of climate change or another pandemic or some other large security issue that spans countries, spans regions. But I don't think so. I'm a little pessimistic about that. And I don't think, you know, the private sector is going to be doing much better on that front. I think there is more general alignment for us in the security field in the private sector, working together across industries, across companies with our competitors to solve a common issue. But there are countervailing forces. There are obviously not everyone's on the same page about what to do next and who should be contributing the most and in what way. And I think that does not bode well for us as a global community.
Thank you. Stuart, if you think about that list of potential threats or actual threats, how would you rank them in terms of what you see as the greatest?
Yeah, thank you. I'm in largely in alignment with my fellow panelists. Middlebury educates some very smart kids, but I think the one thing I would add was I think nuclear proliferation just along that as well. I mean, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists came out with its annual doomsday clock, which it publishes each year, and the three major things that it kept the hands at 100 seconds before midnight. But basically what it's trying to say was that, look, we have three major problems going on. We've got nuclear nonproliferation and basically the fraying of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. And so that hangs in the background still. There's climate change, which again is the president has called an existential threat, which, which is basically the largest collective action problem that the world has ever faced. And the corporate community, as Stone just pointed out, is really important in that. And I was heartened by the fact that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest institutional investor, basically said that they were going to start looking at climate change on the balance sheets, climate change risks on the balance sheets of the companies they invested in. And then finally, pandemics. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs this spring called When the System Fails, and basically was about exactly what both what David and Stone talked about, which is the total failure of international cooperation to actually address these things. The solidarity is what failed. The one thing I would also finally add is that terrorism, which of course preoccupied us after 9/11, the global war on terrorism is really much more of a rounding error, I think, in terms of what, at least international terrorism, in terms of the way we're thinking about international security now. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's shift gears and move from these rather broad issues of security matters to questions about the relationships between the world's great powers themselves. How would you characterize the bilateral relationship between the United States and its traditional competitors or adversaries? And by that, I mean countries like China and Russia. Who would like to begin?
I'd be happy to jump in there because I've actually one of the perks of my job is that I've been working to brief our current spokesperson to starting the State Department's daily brief, which if people are interested in that sort of thing, it's going to be starting next Tuesday. So we'll have a daily brief. And he's been very clear, and President Biden obviously giving the direction, and Tony Blinken, the secretary, whose first day it was today, have been very clear that Russia, obviously the two big competitors, the two big entities, Russia and China, that Russia under Vladimir Putin is an adversary, and one that must be countered from a position of strength when necessary, while also at the same time continuing to foster cooperation on areas vital to U.S. National interest. Now that's going to be a challenge, but we're going to have to deter Russia's illegal and sort of reckless actions across the board. We also need to build our resilience, as I've discussed, and the resilience of our allies to counter Russian challenges, and as well to support the Russian people. You've been seeing a remarkable scene in Russia with Alexander Navalny's return and the sort of upheaval that's going on right now. But then we also can't lose sight of the fact that because of things like climate change, because of things like nuclear nonproliferation, because of regional conflicts, that we have to also work with the Russians where our interests align. China is a slightly different issue. I think the way this administration is going to be talking about China, you're going to see, is competition. A strategic competition with China is going to define the 21st century. And there's no way around that. No way, I think it's going to be very hard to see, a grand bargain with the Chinese or a reset in relationship. But, we clearly also have to be able to work with the Chinese on all of the above mentioned issues. So that's really, if Russia is going to be a challenge, but the China relationship is the one that's going to define, at least on a bilateral level, the next, as Stone was saying, the next 20 to 100 years.
I see.
And I frankly feel like we've lost a little bit of time on that.
I see. Stuart, how do you view these relationships?
Yeah, I very much agree with David. I think that, the Russia relationship will be highly adversarial, and President Biden was apparently very tough in his conversation with President Putin this week about electoral interference, poisoning of Alexei Navalny, Ukrainian sovereignty, the bounties that the Russians have apparently put on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. So there's a communication there was that there's a new sheriff in town, and that sort of Trump's era of coddling Russia is over. So I predict a certain amount of rough antagonism. The good news was that he also, though, reached an agreement with Mr. Putin extend the New START Treaty, which is basically the last remaining arms control agreement after the demise of the INF Treaty between the two countries. With respect to China, I agree. There's going to be a lot of continuity with the Trump administration in this. I think the style is certainly going to be different, but Secretary Blinken at his confirmation hearings basically was resigned to the fact that efforts to try to socialize China, which have been done since the George W. Bush administration, had, in a sense, failed, and that there was going to have to be more of a hard-nosed approach to China, both in terms of its regional assertiveness, its sort of mercantilist trade policy, its human rights violations in Xinjiang, which Mr. Blinken referred to as genocide. So there's a lot, I think that there's a lot of friction there. The key, I think, to improving the relationships with China, I think ultimately you're going to have some kind of understanding on Taiwan. You're going to have some reassurance that the United States is not actually fomenting or actively fomenting for regime change. But you're also going to have to persuade the Chinese that the U.S. alliance system will persist. But perhaps there could be some areas of cooperation on climate change, for instance, in cooperation on clean energy technologies. But yeah, trying to get to a place where we can acknowledge our frictions with these countries, but then also acknowledge the need to compartmentalize those so that we can actually work with them on other things is really important. What you saw during the pandemic, which was so devastating, was that the Trump administration allowed, for instance, its peak with China in its lack of transparency with respect to the outbreak of the Wuhan virus, sort of totally impede international cooperation, at the UN Security Council, at the G20, at the G7, and all these other multilateral fora. And I think we just need to be more sophisticated because we do need these countries, as David said, to be partners in shared global challenges.
Thank you. Stone, do you have thoughts on these relationships between these great powers, and what factors might have led to them souring even more, their deterioration? What might we do to rectify some of that?
Yeah, so one thing I heard recently from a counterpart in my professional space in private sector security is that the last couple of years have really foot stomped the idea of personnel as policy, not just in the US, but around the world. And I think you can take it a step further and say personality as policy. So when we talk about, what does China want, as if China is a sentient being and not a country, what we're really talking about is maybe one person's idea, President Xi, or we're talking about a small group of folks in the Politburo. Same with the US. Over the past 4 years, it's really been, what does Donald Trump want? And I think going forward, it's important to remember that individual personalities at the highest level really matter. So we've already talked about Russia and China. I'd like to also discuss North Korea. So we haven't really heard from Kim Jong-un in a while, and the general consensus is he's been waiting to see what will shake out and where Biden will head with his policies before he decides to move forward. But it's of great concern to me and others in the aviation world, because every time he launches missiles into the Pyongyang flight information region, we have to respond accordingly and make sure that we're moving away as far as we can with those flight paths. I also think about traditional allies such as Brazil and Mexico, and how AMLO and Bolsonaro are responding to the Biden presidency. And again, this is just personalities at a very high level, but it will dictate policy. And I think a lot about our relationship, the US's relationship with Mexico, and how it looks to be on the security cooperation front, things are fraying a little bit. And maybe that's because, AMLO and Biden don't have as good of a relationship as Obrador did with Trump, but it's an ongoing problem that I think will exacerbate security relations going forward. And then one other country I'd like to mention that often doesn't get mentioned in the great power conversations, but should, is Turkey. And I think here's where we have a bit of a problem, because Biden and Erdogan do not like each other. I'll say that. And it goes even further. We talk about personality as policy. Brett McGurk is now going to be in charge of Middle East and Eurasian affairs, and he'll be interacting a lot with folks in that region. And Brett McGurk and President Erdogan do not have the best of relationships either. So I think it's important to look at sometimes individual relationships between people to see how policy is going to play out over time.
Thank you.
If, Professor Woods, if I could just jump on there, if we might talk about great powers, we cannot forget France and the United Kingdom, and the deep doldrums that the United Kingdom has had to go through during this whole Brexit debate. As we think about going forward over the next sort of 3, 4, 5 10 years out, when we think about competition with China, when we think about having to confront Russia, one of our greatest tools, or one of our greatest assets, is our relationship with the European Union and with the United Kingdom. And so thinking about the modalities of how you restore confidence in the United Kingdom, that you mobilize Europe, are going to be central tenets to whatever successes that we're going to have going forward, realizing that there will still be areas, especially with the French, that we will have some divergences, but that the vast majority we don't, and that we're going to have to really, to me, really focus in on the sort of the multilateral with those two institutions, with those two countries, and Germany as well.
Thank you, David. And you actually segued into the next question that I wanted to ask, which was the flip side of that original question about our adversaries or competitors. I wanted to ask you all about how you view the relationship between the United States and other great powers who are our friends or traditional allies, particularly Great Britain, France, the EU, we would say that, Japan, Canada, those types of actors. What do those relationships look like at this point? Stuart?
Sure. I mean, I think that we really have had a situation over the last 4 years, which has been extraordinary. To be sure, and that is the estrangement between the United States and some of its closest allies. And I think some of that, to be sure, was structural, right? Since the end of the Cold War, we've had a lack of a common adversary. And so you have divergent threat perceptions, not least, for instance, concerning China. And that's led to some natural distancing. But Donald Trump is also hugely responsible for this estrangement. His attacks on sort of relentless attacks on NATO, his suggestions that the European Union should dissolve or that France should leave the European Union, his attacks on the G7 and indeed the very concept of the West and Western solidarity, which has been basically the foundation of the liberal international order, as it's called. He's basically taken a wrecking ball to the world that America made, or he did when he was in office. And I think that led to a lot of doubts about U.S. staying power. And now there is this hope, I think, amongst transatlantic folks who believe in the liberal international order, that somehow we'll look back in this sort of period of 4 years as this weird aberration, right? This parenthesis between two sort of normal periods of American internationalism, American transatlanticism, American championship of the West. The difficulty with that is that, the United States has shown that it can turn on a dime 180 degrees twice in the space of 4 years. So the question is, are those countries going to hedge their bets? I do think that Joe Biden is in a great position to improve this in this transatlantic, or in terms of particularly the transatlantic world. NATO's already come up with a draft new strategic concept that goes well beyond simply focusing on the military relationship, and talks about NATO as a political actor, including dealing with China. And then the EU and the United States are poised to also have, at least Brussels has proposed a new relationship with the United States, calling it a once-in-a-generation opportunity. So I think there are some opportunities there for sure for the administration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Stone, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see the continuity of leadership in Germany. We talk about Europe and the importance of Europe. Now with Angela Merkel stepping down, I think a lot of people were concerned about where that might head, but Armin Laschet is now taking up the mantle, at least with the CDU, and probably will end up going and leading the country. Again, I want to stick on this theme as sort of personality as policy, because we look at individual actors and how they responded, especially to Biden's presidency. One of the strongest I saw from Europe was Pedro Sanchez saying that it felt like, the last 4 years were a bad dream. And hopefully, they can move forward and re-engage with the US in the way that they're used to. And I think across the board, you're seeing that in especially in Europe with our traditional partners. What we saw Biden do right away coming into the office was to call very traditional, call Trudeau up in Canada, call AMLO down in Mexico, and call Boris Johnson in the UK or in the UK. And so I think what you're seeing there is sort of a symbolism. You're seeing a messaging to our partners that we're returning in some sense to the way things used to be done. But I think it's important to look at partners that we perhaps haven't fostered as much in the past and to give them more of our time and more of our attention. And I think again about Central America and South America and how important our own hemisphere is, at least from the US standpoint, and how we really need to be engaging more deeply with those countries and with other countries around the world where in the past we've let things slide a bit. Africa is an entire continent where we really, as a country, have not had as much engagement as we should have. And I hope that in the future, yes, there is that re-engagement with our traditional allies, but we're also looking forward and trying to forge new relationships or stronger relationships with allies who we have let slide in the past.
Thank you. I would, as an observer, reiterate what you've said about our neglect of neighbors to the south. We typically don't tend to look at them or focus on them as much as we do other areas of the world. Latin America in particular has not been a consistent high priority in the United States global outlook. And sometimes the Latin Americans would tell us that's good, because sometimes when you do look at us, it's unwanted, the things that happen. I would like to go back and take the conversation back to a point that someone raised earlier, which was about alliances. Unlike some of the world's great powers, China and Russia, for example, the United States has had a very long history of strong, durable alliances stretching far back into the 1940s, partnerships and allies around the world in Asia, Europe, North America, trading partnerships with many countries beyond those regions. Now, traditionally, these alliances, as has been mentioned, have helped augment American power and enhanced the security of the various states involved. And the question here then is really twofold. What has happened to our alliances, to our partnerships lately? They seem to be in pretty rough shape. Why are they so frayed? But the second point is the devil's advocate. If alliances such as NATO, as you say, can be restored, is that worth the trouble, given the types of transnational security threats that we sometimes face? What good is an alliance like NATO, for example, against a threat like COVID or against illicit trafficking, these sort of non-military global security threats? Would someone like to address alliances in ways that we haven't discussed at this point?
Can I pick up on that just really quickly? I won't talk about why they're so. I won't talk about why they're so frayed, because I think it sort of covered that a bit in discussion, particularly with the Trump era. But I do think that actually it's important to look at alliances as a force multiplier for the United States, for U.S. foreign policy, and also for a way for the United States to perhaps adopt a policy of a little bit more restraint, a little bit more offshore rather than being onshore, which I think a lot of the American public like. But I do also think that what you're seeing, even within NATO with this new strategic concept, is actually they mention, the alliance mentions climate, not only in trying to reduce the carbon footprint of the relative militaries, et cetera, but about how that is going to be something that climate change, as Stone suggested, is going to be driving an entire sort of new group of environmental migrants, which will create security problems. So they're engaged on the climate front. They're also engaged on the pandemic front in a number of ways. And then they've also sort of embracing the notion of combating trafficking and transnational crime, as well as cyber conflict, et cetera. So, they're looking for a new, more political mission that goes beyond simply military. There will obviously have to be other instruments that are more diplomatic in nature, but I do think that it hasn't yet outlived its usefulness, I would say.
If I might jump in a little bit on there, I think we have to start with an understanding that the unipolar era is over, and I think we've all accepted that. At least the people on this panel have accepted that. And we need to understand that there are going to be times when there are going to be certain partners, and I won't go into all the different disputes that we've got, but certain partners will go their own way on on issues. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to be thinking more flexibly about what our alliance structures need to look like. We can't sort of be Manichaean. You're either with us or against us in our approach to sort of building these alliances. We can work with certain countries on cybersecurity. We can work with others on sort of containing China in the East. You don't necessarily have to agree on every aspect of human rights, for instance, in order to say, okay, we have some common interests in mind. So I think we have to open the aperture a good bit more and not think about things in a black and white way. I'm sort of avoiding getting into specifics due to the nature of my job, because I don't want to get out in front of where this administration is going. But that would be the North Star that I'd be heading towards.
Okay, our time is dwindling, and I'd like to get to a different topic before we begin entertaining questions from our students. If we could switch gears and think about domestic events here in the United States. Given things that have happened here during the US election cycle, I think we need to talk about global security as it pertains with what has been happening domestically, particularly since the election in November, the insurrection there in January 6th. And so I've got two interrelated questions here. First, can you talk a little about how political instability in the US and the undermining of Americans' confidence in their own democracy might somehow make global security more endangered? The second interlinked question is unraveling of democracy here in the United States. What links are there between that and the likelihood of great power cooperation, or the inability of great powers to cooperate in order to address some of these transnational security threats?
You looking for a taker?
Please.
Yeah, just really briefly. There's no question that they've taken the sheen. The events of January 6th and indeed the previous 4 years have taken a lot of the sheen off of American exceptionalism. Maybe some of that might be good, but the credibility of U.S. global leadership, in particular our soft power, has definitely taken a hit. So you've got adversaries from China to Iran to Russia to Venezuela making hay and trolling the United States, offering sort of democracy assistance, if you will. In terms of security threats being exacerbated, I think that really will only come if countries no longer see the United States as being interested in shaping the world at all. If they feel that the United States is so fragile and lacks such confidence that it's going to retrench to such a degree, then I think that some countries and partners and allies might hedge their bets, particularly with respect to other great powers. And the other danger, of course, is the United States is so distracted that other great powers will exploit it. On the flip side, if the United States didn't care about democracy anymore, which I find implausible in the long term, both domestic democracy and also the promotion of democracy abroad, if the United States didn't care, in some ways, that would make cooperation with Russia and China easier, because they don't care about democracy either. So I'd sort of flip the question around like that. But I have, over the long term, I think, the fact that if the United States can come to terms with the weaknesses and fragilities of its own democracy, I think that it will show a country that's capable of self-correction and actually looking inward at some of the warts and flaws that we possess in our own society.
Thanks, Stu. We have one more minute before I want to get to student questions. Does anyone have some insights they'd like to contribute with respect to events here in the United States and their impact on our ability to contribute to addressing these security threats? Okay, well, let's turn then to the topic of careers in the security field. Over the course of this program this evening, we've identified several global security challenges. And as we know, great challenges create opportunities. Could each of you please comment, each of the panelists, comment very briefly on what you see as the career-related opportunities that lie ahead in addressing global security challenges? Very, very briefly, are these opportunities in what particular areas? Are they domestic policy or foreign relations, diplomacy, those types of things? Let's start with Stone, and then we'll go to David and Stu, and then we'll get to our students.
I'll speak to the private sector opportunities, and I think there are a lot of them, and that will continue to be the case going forward. One thing that I've noticed within the private sector security intelligence community over the past year is that companies that have the means to hire new people to do this work have been doing so. And it's because they need to understand what's happening in the world. They need someone or multiple people on staff telling them, here's what to make of these global challenges. Here's what's happening in this country or this region. And here's how we as a company should be responding. And I've seen a huge growth in certain industries of private sector security intelligence analysts, of other people in the security space. So if you're looking at the private sector, the future is very bright. And unfortunately, that's because we have so many challenges and companies are increasingly being pulled into those challenges specifically. We as an airline have gotten on the wrong side of certain governments in the past. Other companies, US companies and foreign companies, are on the wrong side of certain issues. That is something that will only continue to grow, I think, in the future, and more executives and company personnel will be asked to take a stance on political issues, both in the US and globally. And that takes someone internally telling you what you should feel about a certain thing or how you should respond to a certain global event. So lots of opportunities in the private sector.
Thank you, Stone. David?
Listen, lots of opportunities in the public sector. You know, I don't think we can get away with believing that the United States isn't going to play a major role. You know, the contours of what that role are going to be may always be debated. But whether the United States does or does not have a role to play in the international arena, that, I mean, to me, is never going away. The size of the U.S. economy, whatever it is, 20-25% of GDP, is not something, means that we will always be engaged, if for no other reason than helping McDonald's and, you know, Coca-Cola open up new markets. And, you know, there will always be, whether it's in the intelligence field, whether it will be in you know, as part of the military world, or, you know, the one that's near and dear to my heart, diplomacy, there's going to be jobs, and there's going to be opportunities for people. And if I had just one small little piece for your viewers, is take advantage of your time at Middlebury to take like weird classes and off the wall classes, and, you know, push into areas that you haven't ever thought of before, because that will make you a more rounded individual. And if you're really looking for real opportunities, you know, people who can do lots of different stuff, you're always going to find a way to find a job. So, you know, take advantage of your 4 years at Middlebury to build a varied skill set.
Thank you for that plug. Stu, very quickly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, I just would say that, you know, there are many public and private sector jobs available. I mean, just around Washington, where I am, just on the private sector front, so many consulting firms, contractors in national security and the homeland security space. There's also huge numbers of NGOs, foundations addressing different aspects of security, diplomacy, and development. And then, of course, in the legislative branch or in the legal profession, just enormous numbers of opportunities. I think for those interested in entering the State Department, in addition to foreign service jobs, the civil servants are also a real backbone of the U.S. State Department. I can talk a little bit later maybe about specific sort of areas of expertise that might be useful in the changing environment, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn now to a few career-related questions from our students. Joining us for this portion of the program are Grace Carroll, class of 22 at the college in Vermont and majoring in international and global studies. Benji Renton, class of 21 at the college, who's also majoring in international and global studies. And finally, Susan Stalter, who in 2020 earned a master's in international policy and development at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, and who's currently pursuing a master's in Russian from Middlebury now. So Grace, why don't you kick us off with a question, please?
Great, thank you so much, Professor Williams. And I'd also like to thank the three panelists for taking the time to have this great conversation with us today. So some people might argue that a technical background is more attractive to potential employers who are hiring in global security fields. In your experiences, is this true? How can students tailor their resumes to showcase a liberal arts degree and its benefits? And David, I know you're beginning to talk about this, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I'll take advantage of that and jump in.
Yeah.
Look, I'll speak maybe more on the State Department side, but I think that sort of it dovetails into a lot of other jobs looking at international security. Of varied backgrounds. If you can show that you can do a lot of different things, I think that to me is the greatest starting point, that you can take a problem and you can look at it not from one vantage point, but from 5, 6, 7, 8 different types of vantage points, and you can get creative. And that's really where the core of the liberal arts approach comes from. I'd also like to take advantage of a separate part, since you asked about your resume, is, and certainly, and this has been a lot in the press recently, about the State Department and how it's kind of, it used to be pale male in Yale, but now it's just still, but it's still like sort of unfortunately very male dominated, or white male dominated, even though that has changed over the last couple of years. But I would definitely say that, the current department and the current leadership, and Tony Blinken has definitely said it in his confirmation hearing, and it's sort of permeating across the entire leadership structure of the department, is that we have to do a better job of the national security structure reflecting the composition of the United States. And we shared with, I think it was with Tim, some places, some different avenues into the State Department, some different fellowships, the Pickering Fellowship, the Wrangell program, ways that, traditionally underrepresented groups have sort of can funnel effectively into the State Department. And I would really encourage, those of you on this call who sort of fit, whatever it is into that world, to really take a long and hard look at working at the department. There isn't one type of person. It takes everything. And that's really, that's what I love about my job. Just if I can have like one last little plug about the State Department and a Foreign Service officer, is we move around every 2 to 3 years. So if you only knew how to do one thing, your career wouldn't last very long. Building up that broad skill set, bringing your own unique background, no matter what that is, into the job and throwing it in, just the way to do it.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a comment to address to Grace's question?
Sure, I do. I think I'm a huge fan of liberal arts education. I think it's essential for grappling with historical, philosophical, cultural, and ethical dimensions of U.S. foreign policy. As an anecdote, when people were going to the Coalition Provisional Authority, I think this is in George Packer's book, The Assassin's Gate, when they went in after the invasion of Iraq, people were a little bit worried that a lot of people reading material on the plane was not about the modern Middle East or even the historical Middle East, but was basically memoirs about how to denazify Germany after the invasion in 1945. So that's one signal that a liberal arts education might be a little helpful. Another thing is being able to write well, for God's sake, and communicate. One of my former students, when I taught at SAIS, became senior director at the NSC and the executive secretary of the National Security Council, largely because he was an English major and he knew how to write. And so my own major was in human biology, evolution, which is basically a life and social sciences mixture. And but I also did honors in humanities. And so, you know, a mile wide and an inch thick, but it helps to have some perspective, I think. And I think it's helped me. Others may disagree. But.
Thank you. Let's go to Benji. Do you have a question, Benji?
Thank you all for such an informative discussion and conversation. My question concerns grad school and sort of further graduate study, whether that's more of a professional program or a research-based degree. Do you see grad school as a necessary step for continuing a career in global security? And how do you balance that with an early career type opportunity? And how does the timing of that work after college?
I can start off with this one. Benji, we talked about this a few days ago. I think for me, I was immediately looking at grad school, and that's because right after Middlebury, I moved down to Washington, D.C., and recognized that in order to get in the door, even at an entry-level job, I needed a master's degree. And that is not always the case, but I would say with many positions in the DC world, and that's think tanks, it is the government, it is private sector entities in and around foreign policy, having a master's degree is a big leg up. That said, if I had to do it all over again, I would have waited a few more years, gotten more work experience, and then figured out what it was I wanted to do for grad school. I'm very happy with my degree. Georgetown was a great place, especially if you're interested in foreign affairs, foreign policy. It's a fantastic university. But I think to the extent that you're able to, getting a few years under your belt of some sort of work experience. And for me, it was research. I was working at a law firm, which has served me greatly in my current role doing intelligence analysis. It served me really well at the State Department. And it goes to the points we've talked about previously. You sort of want a Swiss Army knife approach to things. You want to be able to do a lot and to use whatever sources of information you have for the job that you're performing. So I think doing research at a law firm actually translated really well to what I'm doing now. But one thing I would say is, if it's possible, wait a few years before going to grad school to get that experience and to know what you want to do in the future.
I see the panelists' heads nodding to the last point that Stone made. Our time is flying. I'd like to get to our last question if we can. Susan, would you like to pose your question, please?
Sure. Thank you all for this wonderful discussion. I'm kind of interested in hearing, after we've had this discussion about the importance of international collaboration, international relations, at the same time as we're kind of seeing a bit of a trend away from international collaboration, more generally, but also due to the pandemic, for instance. And we've had some recent discussions about the US State Department and potential reorganization to create opportunities for more entry into the US State Department, say for professionals already midway through their career. How would you guys characterize sort of the future trends in opportunities for careers in diplomacy versus careers in more domestically focused security fields? Would you see, any trends based on the trend away from international collaboration? And do you see it as perhaps creating the government seeking to create more opportunities in diplomacy, or seeing more focus on domestically based security careers?
I'd be happy to start with that. I'll be very quick. One of my personal heroes in the foreign policy world is a former ambassador named Chas Freeman, who says, diplomacy is how a nation advances its interests and resolves its problems with minimal violence. There's always going to be a market for that. And so, I don't, sure, there may be some talk about how the United States has not been great at the diplomacy game for the past, 20 some odd years, and especially over the last 4. But we are always going to need to forward our interests and hopefully do it with a minimal amount of violence. And so I don't think, this career in diplomacy is going anywhere. And then 2, just to say that diplomacy is security. It is national security. And so, if you're looking for, if you're interested in the field, of getting into the field, you're going in the right direction in both ways.
Thank you. Any other comments from our panelists for Susan?
I think there is going to be a big task ahead for the Biden administration in rebuilding aspects of the foreign service that were allowed to atrophy. But I would agree with David that I see this as a, I don't anticipate any pullback. I think if anything, I think there will be an overcorrection, not an overcorrection, but a correction in the other direction.
Hopefully not an overcorrection.
Yeah, no, not an overcorrection. And also I agree with David also that there is a groundswell that hopefully will somehow get over the iron triangle of the defense industrial complex so that there is actually more resources and training and staffing that goes into the civilian side of U.S. global engagement, which has been underfunded for so long and under-resourced for so long. Certainly something I recognized when I was at the State Department many years ago. So I think that the idea of bringing in mid-career people is kind of exciting if it doesn't come at the expense of bringing in younger people. I do find that sometimes it's a little stultifying if you can only go in to be in the State Department if you sort of, as a Foreign Service officer, if you start at quite a young age and then continue along that track. I think there might be a little bit more fluidity, just as there is in the private sector, for people to be able to make a contribution, and maybe after they've done something elsewhere. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much. I wish we had time for more questions. I'd like to thank our students for joining in this conversation. Thank you very much. And thank you for providing us with food for thought. Those are some really good questions. To all 3 of our guests, Stuart and David and Stone, thank you so much for your time and your generosity, your contributions to our understanding of the global security landscape and career opportunities that await students who are interested in making a difference in this field. To the audience, thank you for joining us this evening. Please stay tuned for future Live from DC episodes, which will be coming beginning next month, and which will examine other policy realms and career options with alumni and with parents. On February 10, for example, the program is titled Growing Challenges in Cybersecurity. And on February 17, the program will be transitioning to a green economy. A final word to students who are in our audience. What we've had this evening was a broad overview of a range of security challenges. And for those of you who are really interested in global security and want to learn more about career options, I'd encourage you to tune into the Mid-Vantage series, where beginning in March, there will be episodes that are devoted to specific security challenges and security careers within those fields. These episodes will focus on such areas as alliances, on China's rise, the pandemic, international development, and so on. You can find these on the CCI website beginning in March. I encourage you to take a look. Thank you all again for joining us this evening. Good night, everybody.